Hey everyone, this is Jane with Herbal, and in this video, I'm going to share with you some information on a little known plant called bloodroot. Now, bloodroot is in the poppy family, and it is a beautiful, beautiful plant with a deep, deep, rich history. And here's what I wrote at the beginning of this, because this really describes it perfectly. This is a plant that asks for discernment. Some plants invite use, and others invite understanding first. And that is definitely the case with bloodroot. Now, bloodroot is also known as Sanguinaria canadensis, which is always a mouthful with some of these plants. But I'm going to put that down below this video and you can kind of look at what that looks like. Sanguinaria canadensis is what it's known as. Okay, it's always a powerful, precise, and unforgiving of carelessness. So that is how I would best describe bloodroot. Powerful, precise, and unforgiving of carelessness, okay? Cultures that worked with it historically did so with restraint, context, and deep respect for consequence. So this is really what I want to impart to you today, that while this is a very special plant, it should not be something that you use lightly, you use carelessly. In fact, this is one of those plants that modern medicine and its ability to scale, and even think about plants that you can scale, like turmeric or cayenne pepper. You know, some of these plants can scale to the populations, but there's plants like bloodroot that should be used sparingly, with caution, with care, and sometimes not at all, depending on what your body's going through. And there's this beautiful bunch of information that I've gathered that I'm excited to share with you, because to me, there's a small handful of plants that belong in this category, that you use this with deep wisdom and care and knowledge. In fact, this is a plant that my dad was very familiar with. He put it into his ESSEAC formula in a very, very tiny, small, absolute perfect amount, along with 5 other herbs. So this is a plant I've been very familiar with. I've used it once or twice a year for its blood cleansing, blood purification properties. And it's one of those things that I've used for probably 40 years. And I still carry a very deep respect for it, because I've seen it do amazing things. And it's one of those things that just takes discernment. I've written down some things that I don't want to miss, because I really want to share and impart the beautiful wisdom that is associated with this plant. Okay, now bloodroot is in the poppy family, and it's a very small ground cover plant. In fact, here's what I wrote: bloodroot is indigenous to the Eastern North America natives, which are now Eastern Canada, the Northeastern and Midwestern United States, the Appalachian, and the Great Lakes regions. Okay, so, and what it likes is this: it likes thriving under canopies of maple, beech, oak, and hickory. So it's kind of like a ground cover. It's, you know, underneath leaves that have fallen, it'll poke its head up. I've been blessed enough to see this plant and actually harvest a small amount of it many, many years ago with my dad. And it is very short blooming. In fact, let me keep going with this, because this is some really great information. This was a very important plant to the Native Americans and many indigenous tribes throughout the centuries that this plant has been used, and that people have been on the earth. Okay. And the thing is, they both understood the usefulness and the dangers of it. Okay. Bloodroot was never a casual plant. This was never a casual plant for the Native Americans, and even now, modern herbalists, people like my dad, botanists, and people who are familiar with plants, plant medicine, the power of them. There is a small handful of plants that sit in this category, and bloodroot is one of them. It was never used as food. It was never used as like a daily tonic. It was used with deep wisdom and care, and sometimes it was not used at all. Okay. Its role was very specific, and it was limited. It was used by knowledgeable hands and only when appropriate, which I love. Now, bloodroot grows it's really an early bloomer, and it reminds me a little bit of limation that way, where it blooms early in the spring, and then by the time the early summer comes, the flower has already died, and the plant has kind of actually gone back a little bit to the ground. Okay, so it emerges very early in the spring, often while the frost is still possible. It produces a single white flower that opens briefly and then it fades. And then this is which is so cool. The leaf unfurls after the flowering and wraps protectively around the stem. So once the flower blooms, the leaves open up and the leaf wraps around the stem and protects it. I mean, it is such a beautiful plant, and it's very small. It grows along, like I said, underneath the canopy of these trees in the forest. If you know how to identify it, and especially the best time to do that is in the spring, when that little flower, that single one flower pokes itself out. It's a beautiful white flower, and it can make it easy to identify if you're in the right spot and it's the right time of year. Okay. It goes dormant by early summer, disappearing completely from view. And it spreads slowly via the rhizomes, which are the root systems and the rhizomes, okay, not the seeds. And it forms small scattered colonies over many, many years. So this is a plant that has been over harvested. And when that happens, the plant basically shrinks up and stops producing there. So this is a plant that has been over harvested. What I have come to realize after talking to many other herbalists and people who do wildcrafting is that this is a plant that is now really protected by people who know where to get it. And it's not something that you're going to use extensively. You use it with care and with caution. Okay. Because this can be a very toxic plant at high doses and high levels. Okay. This slow, quiet growth pattern mirrors its cultural role, which is this: it's present, it's potent, and it's never abundant. So this is saying the role that I play in culture is that I'm present, I'm slow growing, and I'm never abundant. This is not a very abundant plant. Okay, so the root is what is used, the rhizomes in the root, and when you slice a bloodroot, it's got this red-orange sap that kind of oozes out, okay? When the rhizome is cut, bloodroot releases a vivid red-orange sap. The sap is rich in alkaloids, particular sanguinarine, which accounts for much of the plant's biological activity. Okay, so historically, this intensity was understood as a signal and not an invitation. So think about that. Okay, this is a very intense color plant. The part of it that makes it, give it its power, that red sap that comes out of it, think about that, just the color alone. It signifies intensity. And it's not an invitation, it's a signal. Okay, which is a really interesting way to look at it. Across traditions, strong sensory markers like bitterness, acidity, vivid color often served as a warning. This plant acts decisively. Such plants were approached with caution and not enthusiasm. And this is one of the things I really, really love about being humble when it comes to plant medicine and plant wisdom, because it's not all about, how can I share as much information and get as many people interested in bloodroot as possible. In fact, that is actually quite the opposite, with even the intention of me sharing this video and this information, because it's not possible to share it abundantly, because it doesn't grow that way. It doesn't grow abundantly. And there's other things that you can do for the human body. Like a good example is, many people have heard of something called black salve, and the main herb in there is bloodroot, because it is a caustic, but it's not something you would ever turn to first. In fact, to me, this has given bloodroot a bad reputation. And I think it's just because the wisdom, the tradition, the patience, the knowledge, that has gone by the wayside in the interest of doing something fast and doing something on scale. And this is a plant that's not meant to scale. And modern medicine, even modern plant medicine, we want to scale it. We want to reach more people and share with more people. But this is a plant that does not accept that. I actually really love that. Okay, so it does have a long history with human beings. And then I've got a list of great healthy benefits that it's been used for over the centuries, which are really fun to share. So bloodroot occupies a long and complicated place in North American herbal history. Indigenous use was contextual and controlled, embedded in broader systems of knowledge, ethics, and responsibility. Early Western herbalism adopted the plant, often without the full cultural safeguards leading to misuse. I remember my dad talking about this with me extensively. This was, I'm one of my dad's oldest, and even as a teenager, I was very interested in what my dad did. And even though I went into a whole different industry, a fitness industry as an adult, I was always in love with plants, plant medicine. I use these, I have used these my whole life. But I remember my dad speaking very reverently about not only bloodroot, but other plants that have this same type of context to them. And this is where they're not meant to scale. They're meant to stay quiet, patient, and the person who shares this wisdom should do it carefully without any ego involved. And that to me is where the really rich wisdom comes in. It feels so special to me. So then I wrote this: in the 19th and early 20th centuries, bloodroot actually entered patent medicines and commercial products. In fact, I remember it was in a toothpaste, and it was stripped of all its context and all of the restraint. And actually those products are no longer available, even the toothpaste. I think it was called Vivint, I believe, but I do remember that being in a toothpaste. Interesting, right? The loss of context, not the plant itself, accounts for much of the harm associated with its later history. If you look up certain things about bloodroot or even black salve online, you will see that it was misused quite easily. You can see that, and it got a bad rap because it was supposed to be used tiny amounts with care, and sometimes not at all. Maybe this is not the right person or the right situation. Instead of going for that, maybe there needs to be a different way of healing that takes more patience. So to me, that's so interesting. So here's what I wrote. Bloodroot did not change. The way humans approached it is what changed, which is the perfect way to look at it, right? This is also a plant that is completely shaped by limits. Okay. So here's what I mean by that. Ecologically, bloodroot resists mass use because it does not thrive in disturbed soil. I mean, think about these roadside weeds, weeds or plants that grow prolifically and they like disturbed soil. Well, this does not like disturbed soil. Okay. It does not grow quickly. It declines rapidly when it's over harvested, and it is sensitive to habitat loss. So it's a powerful, powerful plant, but it's very sensitive to over harvesting and all the things, right? For this reason, bloodroot is now considered at risk or locally threatened in parts of its native range. Ethical engagement with this plant today means never harvesting from the wild and supporting conservation-focused cultivation only where appropriate. And I know that that's where we've always sourced ours, is always very carefully. And sometimes we don't have access to it, which is also, you kind of go, okay, that's okay, right? Because that is the way that this plant requires, is the respect, right? Here's what I wrote. There's a way to hold this knowledge responsibly. Bloodroot is best understood not as a remedy, but as a threshold plant, one whose effects demand discernment, timing, and accountability. Those are the three most important things: discernment, timing, and accountability. This is where sometimes the responsibility, the patience, other things first, because this is a threshold plant. This is a plant that is like, okay, we're going to use this because we're going to go after a certain situation carefully and maybe a little aggressively. We need to remember about this, that we need to remember the history, the ecology, the responsibility, and the restraint as wisdom, not fear. You don't want to use restraint because you're afraid of it. You use restraint with this plant because you're using wisdom. Okay. Some plants teach through gentleness and other plants teach through consequence. Bloodroot has always belonged to the latter group. This is where, like I said, if you do any type of research about a product thing called black salve, you will see that there is consequence when it is misused. When used with care, it can be game-changing. That is my perspective. Now, this is a list I'm going to share with you of different things that the indigenous people have used it for over the years. And these are not only well documented in historic texts, but you will actually find some of these things in modern publications. And there's always caveats and talk about how this is toxic and high doses and all of the things. And like I said, this is a plant that's not meant to scale. This is not meant to scale big. And there's a reason. And I actually really love that. This is a very nice, comprehensive, wide variety list of how bloodroot's been used over the centuries, okay? Treating respiratory issues such as coughs, cold, flu, sinus infections, congestion, sore throats, lung conditions. It was used as a tea or inhaled as a powder. It was used to induce vomiting or cleansing during a detoxification process, for fever reduction, relief from rheumatism or joint pain, skin and wound applications, including wounds, cuts, sores, ulcers, ringworm, skin infection, poison ivy, and even use for skin cancer, warts, and other growths. And this was due to its caustic properties, okay, what I was talking about. But it can destroy healthy tissue as well as damaged tissue. This is, again, where the deep wisdom and knowledge comes in. Gastrointestinal aid and for conditions like tuberculosis in some groups. Other miscellaneous uses include blood purifier, toner. This is what I've always used it for, is blood purifier, a diuretic. And then they even put it in love charms and used that red-orange dye to dye the different baskets and different clothes. And so it's been used as a dye as well. And even the Native Americans used it as a war paint, of course, right? So I think that the most interesting thing about this is that while people are familiar with it to a certain extent, especially if you research things that go after certain conditions, and please know that all this information that I share with you is meant to be education and entertainment only. This is not meant to be medical advice. This is simply my own opinion and based on my own experience and my own research. And what I would just say is put this in a category of plants to respect, to love, to revere, and know when and when not to use it. And get with somebody who is knowledgeable. Go on, if you live in a place where this plant grows and you can identify it, that's actually one of the funnest things to do, is to go out and identify plants where they grow in their own environment. And not to go harvest it, because you need to use care when using it, but to simply go see what it looks like where it grows and the time of year that it grows. It is magical. I actually not only got to do this with my dad one time, but about 10 or 12 years ago, I was up in the mountains here in Utah, and I was with a botanist who was a friend of my father-in-law's, and we went up, and there was bloodroot. And it was in the perfect time in the spring, that little white flower. And I was just like, oh my gosh, that's bloodroot. And the botanist I was with, even though he knew what I did, he was surprised that I could identify that plant, because it comes out at such small times during the year. It goes very quickly back underneath the ground cover, and it's hard to see unless you know what you're looking for and you see that little white flower, or other ways to identify it. So here's how I'm going to end this. Some plants teach through gentleness and others teach through consequence. Bloodroot has always belonged to the latter group. Not all healing comes through comfort. Not all medicines are meant to be accessible. And not all knowledge should be portable. Okay? Bloodroot remains what it has always been, a powerful native plant shaped by forest shade, early spring light, and the long memory of those who learned carefully how to approach it. And speak of it with respect is to leave space around it. So I would love to know what you think about bloodroot. Is this something that you are familiar with? Did you know kind of the complexities that come with this, and maybe the reserve and just the humbleness that needs to be afforded a plant like this? Like I said, I've been familiar with this plant for most of my life, and I am grateful because I was able to glean this knowledge from my dad while I was still a teenager. And that was something that I remember deeply. He talked about other plants as well that fit in this category. And in fact, lomatium was one of them. My dad had such a passionate plant love affair with not only bloodroot, but especially lomatium. And I really think about this. My dad, his true love was Native American plants. Even though he loved plants that grew all over the world, Native American plants were what rocked his world. And that flew over me and washed into my DNA. And same with me and my siblings. It's something to this day, we are just fascinated by plants that, grow in the area where we grew up, where I continue to live, where the Native Americans harvested plants and treated them with respect and all the stuff. So I'd love to know if this taught you a little something new about bloodroot and what you think about it. But thanks for tuning in today, guys, and we will see you in the next one.